Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Open Door. Good morning. Jim Hannick here with friends John Breen, although he's fresh in from helping to put out a fire and we'll have to regroup a bit. Mario Ramos Reyes and Christy Yao. Welcome to all our listeners as we present the first panel of the new year. And as always, we'll begin with a prayer. Veni Sancte Spiritus, come Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Let us pray, Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. To launch our first panel, we're going to revisit three of Peter Maurin's easy essays. While they are disconcertingly simple, they masterfully succeed in promoting what he called the clarification of thought. They also call to mind the American Solidarity Party's commitment to a new politics. I'll read each of them in turn and invite the panel to join in wherever they like. Now, if they don't stop me a third of the way through the reading or half of the way through the reading, before we go on to the next reading, they'll comment. Although, as you know, Peter Maurin's essays are easy essays. The first, not a liberal. They say that I am a radical. If I am a radical, then I am not a liberal. The future will be different if we make the present different. But to make the present different, one must give up old tricks and start to play new tricks. But to give up old tricks and start to play new tricks, one must be a fanatic. But liberals are so liberal about everything that they refuse to be fanatical about anything. And not being able to be fanatical about anything, liberals cannot be liberators. They can only be liberals. Liberals refuse to be religious, philosophical, or economic fanatics, but consent to be the worst kind of fanatics, liberal fanatics. That's the first of our easy essays. No one interrupted. So I'm going to ask Mario for some initial reflections.
Good morning. Well, Jim, I think the essay is very challenging, and I was thinking through your reading a couple of concepts there, a couple of words, which I think are very, very interesting, to say the least. Peter Maurin claimed to be a fanatic. And at the same time, he's somehow rejecting the claim that liberals claim not to be fanatic, but they are. They are liberal fanatics. So I'm wondering, what does that mean? The word fanaticism in this context. And the first thought that I have about this is that Peter Maurin, through his life, showed to be, I think, a man of conviction. A man of conviction, not about an ideology, not about a set of ideas completely detached from reality, rather than to reality, say how things are. And I think that's a starting point. In other words, he's not proposing here a new ideology. He's rejecting, and here we see the first rejection, so to speak, about liberalism. We can go and try to discuss what does that mean, but generally it's just a set of ideas completely divorced from how things are. And on the other, in the next essays, we will be reading about this. He's rejecting conservatism as he is understood, generally by some intellectuals, if you will. So to make a conclusion of this very short intervention is that he's proposing something or a new radical way of understanding things, divorce or far away from ideology, which somehow is an artificial way of looking at things.
That seems to me to be right on target, and I'm especially struck by your insistence and his insistence that we begin with things as they are. That makes us first and foremost realists, not crackpot realists, because after all, the universe as we know it is God's good creation, and God keeps it in existence. And it's a reflection of at least something of the mystery of God's inner life. Well, Christy, can you take us a bit ahead?
Sure. So probably not a surprise to anyone here that I do pretty much consider myself a liberal, but I really like this essay, which might seem kind of like a paradox. But I think it talks to not tying yourself down to one ideology. If we go back to, I don't know, freshman year of college philosophy class, words are arbitrary, and especially adjectives are arbitrary. What does it mean to be a liberal? How does a liberal in 1950 compare to a liberal today? And on different issues, it would be different. But then we have a temptation when we think about how language is arbitrary to fall into moral relativism. So I think we have to kind of find the balance, find the medium between those two. And how Peter does this in his essay. I like how he kind of speaks to not getting tied up in one ideology.
All right. And he's going to take on the conservatives next. I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts here. And one is anecdotal and autobiographical, and takes us back to 1967. There I was, St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. What else is in San Antonio, Texas? Why, the Alamo. Knew it well. In part because every Saturday a few of us would picket in front of the Alamo. You were guaranteed to have people come by, including troops. San Antonio, Texas is a military center. And we were mostly focused at that particular time on the bombing of North Vietnam, and then it branched out, went beyond North Vietnam, Laos, for example. At any rate, there I was, and a soldier came by and looked at me and he said, "You're a fanatic." So whenever I hear the word fanatic, I can't help but think, well, I've been identified as a fanatic. I guess in terms of words, it connects also with an aficionado. What's that, Mario? An aficionado?
Aficionado. Someone who is an expert on something. Someone who knows something just because he is habituated to that activity. He's an expert. He is an unlearned person about that subject, if you will. But let me go back to something interesting that you just said about the word liberalism, and you can somehow reflect on fanaticism, as Peter is doing here. I also remember in my college days reading a little book written by a Spaniard back in the early 20th century, which was widespread in the 1960s and 70s, particularly in Latin America, in certain tradition, if you will. The title of the book is Liberalism is a Sin, S-I-N. The Spaniard was Felix Sarda, was a theologian, perhaps of a minor theologian, was not very well known, but the book itself was very well read. It explained in that book a certain point, which was precisely the doctrine of many popes in the 19th century, beginning with Leo XIII and on liberalism. How liberalism in itself became an ideology, rigid, detached from reality, etc., etc., and as such was incompatible with the Catholic tradition. Now, of course, we have come a long way since those times, but in certain ways, Peter Maurin essay remind me about not this view exactly, but the way that he presents about liberalism, which is more than a set of public policies, more than a way of looking at the world. It's a rigid way of understanding the social order without considering realities, rather than, I would say, a dogmatic view of human freedom. Everything is based on freedom without reality, so that freedom become what I want, not what I ought to choose.
There's a lot of conceptual and historical digging to do if we think about the checkered career of liberalism in a doctrinaire sense over the decades. And Christie's pointing that out as well. I would say that and this is the second point I wanted to make here, getting past the anecdote, I would say that by far and away, the most influential thinker, political, social, philosophical, of the last several decades in the United States has been John Rawls, late of Harvard. I think he's been deceased for maybe 15 years or so. But if anybody were to Google John Rawls, R-A-W-L-S, the Google machine would have to cough because he's referenced everywhere. His first book was called A Theory of Justice, A Theory of Justice. And towards the end of this book, he discusses what he calls a dominant end perspective. So if somebody says, what's it all about? And the answer is, in terms of it's all about achieving such and such, then somebody's talking about what it's all about with regard to an end. And if somebody says, and moreover, there's ultimately a single end, then that person is taking a dominant end perspective. Now, once upon a time, I was taught that I should love the Lord our God with my whole heart, my whole mind, my whole soul. Well, that would be a dominant end view. Now, what does Rawls say? I'm going to quote. He says, "Surely it is contrary to our considered judgments of value." Gloss here, my gloss. Think about what you take to be valuable. "Surely it is contrary to our considered judgments of value, and indeed inhuman, to be so taken with but one of these ends that we do not moderate the pursuit of it for the sake of anything else. For a dominant end is at least lexically prior." What does that mean? Comes before everything else. For a dominant end is at least lexically prior to all other aims, and seeking to advance it always takes absolute precedence. Now, who would do such a thing? Next sentence. Thus, Loyola, Ignatius of Loyola, holds that the dominant end is serving God. And then on the very next page, he moves a little back to Aquinas. He says, although Aquinas believes that the vision of God is the last end of all human knowledge and endeavor, he concedes play and amusements a place in our life. Nevertheless, these pleasures are permitted only to the extent that the superordinate aim is thereby advanced, or at least not hindered. So what we have here is the premier liberal of our time saying that if all you do ultimately you do for the greater glory of God, you are inhuman, and you are, as such, a fanatic. Now, the first response I would make to all of this is to mention a successful play of some years back that had a line in it saying, "Your arms are too short to box with God." I mention that because Rawls's conception of God is really a conception of an irrational power source. If you only love God, then you're going to ignore every other good thing. But God, the Christian believes, is in fact the source of every good thing, and every good thing is to be found most fully in God. So there's no tension, no psyche-splitting division between the everyday, ordinary goods that we seek and seeing them all in the light of God's creative and sustaining power. But that's a gauntlet that's thrown down. And it's ultimately based, I would maintain, on a profound misconception of the very nature of our loving Creator. And, of course, Peter Maurin never heard of John Rawls, but John Rawls is a quintessential extension of a certain identifiable kind of political and social thinking that, for better or for worse, has been named liberalism.
Well, Jim, you just went over a few topics, very deep, complex, challenging. This is my first reaction. I think it's more an intuition that I have been following over the past year or so regarding liberalism, or different way of understanding liberalism. And it's the following. It seems to me, I may be mistaken, I may not be correct, but what John Rawls is proposing here, is that, well, liberalism cannot advance a dogmatic view of the political order, dogmatic view of reality, if you will, so that it need to propose something much more humble, which means a rule of the games. In other words, a procedural way of doing things in the social order, so that it doesn't allow a comprehensive view to be dominant. But because that dominance will lead to inhuman society for all the reasons that you just mentioned. So we have there, it seems, two types, if you will, or two area of liberalism. One may be the procedural way of understanding the social order, which is John Rawls' view. And then another more dominant will be substantive issues, more comprehensive, and those issues must be put aside on behalf of this pluralism, not having an inhumane society, and so on. That may be the first reading that one may have about this Rawls view. But on the other, and after reading and rereading Peter Maurin, it seems to me that something else is at work here, is working here, which is, well, these procedural rules that he is proposing in themselves are dominant, are dogmatic, are comprehensive. In themselves, they propose a view of religion, a view of economics, a view of philosophy. So they are not really neutral like he claims to be. If that is the case, then that second view, if you will, undermine even Rawls' claim. So he's wanting to propose something neutral. He isn't, because in itself, liberalism by its own nature is dogmatic, or is, if you will, fanatic. And I think that reading today is taking somehow many scholars or people who are studying liberalism are taking seriously. In other words, those who are living in the faith, in the Christian faith, are feeling the heat about liberalism, which is becoming totalitarian. And I think that is the reflection that we need to start thinking about.
Well, I'm certainly with you, as you know, but I can imagine someone saying, here are some philosophers claiming to go deeper, but where they're going is where nobody really is. And I'm thinking that Christy might want to say something here. She said she's inclined to think of herself as a liberal, but I doubt if she's inclined to think that Ignatius of Loyola or Thomas Aquinas were fanatics and inhuman. And maybe she'd say, well, liberal is such a slippery term. The term liberal is so slippery that who knows next what somebody's going to say about it. But in popular, ordinary, energetic, everyday life, It's seen as a kind of open spirit and nothing more than that. What would you say, Christy?
Sure. So I definitely wouldn't call Ignatius of Loyola or Thomas Aquinas inhuman. I think Rawls' main fault was that he didn't have a clear understanding of what God is and of what religion is. I think somewhere the logic kind of, for such an educated guy, the logic kind of disconnected. It reminded me kind of what you were quoting from him, reminded me of a conversation I had on Christmas with a friend who was staying with me about how she's getting her PhD in philosophy, or not philosophy, theology. I apologize. And she said she loves theology so much because it's the pursuit of the truth. It's what's true. And that kind of struck me in a way that I hadn't really thought about religion and theology and Catholicism before. We're looking to what is the highest truth and to what is the most true. But if, like so many, I will say a lot of liberals believe in the heresy of relativism, then there is no truth. Then truth doesn't matter. Then Rawls would be 100% correct. And I think that was his main, and many liberals who want to do good, who want to work for social justice, who want to bring up the poor, that's their main flaw, that they just don't understand there is such a thing as right and wrong, and there is such a thing as truth. And it's kind of sad that it's such a novel and kind of radical or fanatical concept these days that there is such a thing as truth, and that right and wrong do exist.
It's interesting. You've done it twice now that you see a connection between an uncritical liberalism and a slide into relativism. I don't like to say bad things about my relatives, but what the heck? At any rate, I want to offer one more background point here, and then let's go ahead and take a look with Peter at the conservatives. There's a journal that I know that a fair number of people in the American Solidarity Party are familiar with, and from time to time, with suitable conditions, refer to, and it's called First Things. And the idea behind the journal, which was started by Richard John Neuhaus a good couple of decades ago, is that in the public sector, we ought to look first to first things. And rather than excluding any kind of theology or excluding any kind of developed philosophy in favor of pure procedure, rather than excluding, we ought to include them, that they belong among the first things. Now, in the current issue, there's a short 2-page intriguing essay by a historian of the Civil War. And the title, and I always think that, well, the author usually doesn't give the title, but the title is intriguing as well. Lincoln lost, Douglas won. The references to the Abraham Lincoln-Stephen Douglas debates that led really to Lincoln becoming a national figure and, in short enough order, the president. Now, I'm going to once again do a little reading. I'm just going to read the last couple of paragraphs in this piece by Alan Guelzo of interesting location, Gettysburg College. When you think of the Civil War, you're apt to think of Gettysburg, and there he is, a good place for a historian of the Civil War. So here's Guelzo. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are famous for Lincoln's eloquence and for the boost they gave him toward national political success. But there is some question as to whether in modern America it is Stephen A. Douglas who has prevailed in the shaping of our political philosophy. And now the author cites a very well-known philosopher, Michael Sandel, who's at Harvard. Michael Sandel, in his book Democracy's Discontent, described Douglas as the embodiment of a procedural republic, in which moral and religious arguments are excluded from the public square in order to dampen conflict and achieve political peace. The result, Sandel warned, is a political order too morally feeble to recognize evil for what it is, whether internally or as an external threat, provided that a majority, a popular majority, a congressional majority, a judicial majority, recognizes as a civil right any personal preference. The procedural republic has no power to interfere, much less condemn. Thank you for your patience. One more paragraph. The purpose of democracy, as Douglas understood it, is to be an end in itself. And whatever a democratic majority decides to sanction must stand as law. Or, this is in parentheses, as Justice Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, put it, quote, "If my fellow citizens want to go to hell, I will help them. It's my job." He's known for his bluntness. Lincoln, however, understood democracy as a means, a good, natural, and just means, but only a means toward helping a republic achieve the good that is embodied in natural law. Well, I think that that presents the questions that we've been discussing for the last few minutes in yet another historical context, the context that led up to the horrible Civil War in the United States. How about then we turn from liberals to conservatives? Peter's second essay is as follows. Title, Not a Conservative. If I am a radical, then I am not a conservative. Conservatives try to believe that things are good enough to be let alone. But things are not good enough to be let alone. Conservatives try to believe that the world is getting better every day in every way. But the world is not getting better every day in every way. The world is getting worse every day in every way, and the world is getting worse every day in every way because the world is upside down. And conservatives do not know how to take the upside down and put it right side up. When conservatives and radicals will come to an understanding, they will take the upside down and they will put it right side up. The end. Mario, what do you say about not being a conservative?
I would begin by just reminding what you said before when you read about the claim that that historian of the Civil War says that, well, Douglas won. I heard you reading very attentively, and I think he's right. When you look around and see how Congress and work today, perhaps we can reflect again. I don't want to be repetitive, but on how we define liberalism, and even further than that, how we define freedom. Remembering just what Casey, Pennsylvania, Planned Parenthood versus Casey said about freedom. But nevertheless, that's the first reflection. But going back to what you just read on not being a conservative, again, here it seems that Peter is referring to an ideology, a way of understanding the world that focus rather than on how things are. Even though in this particular essay, he concedes something to the conservative quote-unquote side, if you will. But he's saying, well, then there are certain ways by which the conservative are looking at the world. But this is not good enough. This is not our way of doing things. In other words, liberals and conservative, according to these two essays, are emphasizing how I think things are. In other words, focusing on the subject, focusing on the intellectual, focusing on the person who thinks how the world works, rather than open your understanding or open your eyes to the reality which is out there and begin from there. It's not a question of ideological lenses rather than reality itself, which is going to give you the input how to approach to those things. And I think that is clear. And what is clear is when he observed, and I'm just referring here to Peter, when he observed the world, he is very blunt in his description, because he says, well, the world is not getting better. Every day in every way, the world is getting worse every day in every way. In other words, don't come up and tell me that things are better because this is what your ideology is telling you. Rather than be honest, reflect about reality. And we need to start from there in order to take the world which is upside down, right side up. In other words, we can understand things are not getting better, but from there we can work together and see how things can improve. In other words, to conclude briefly, I think in both cases he is denouncing this ideological view of things.
And at some point, the question of whether it's possible to get past your own perspective, whether it's possible to look to reality itself, at some point a thinker has to address that. But that takes us even further into the efforts of classical philosophy and the attempts to dismiss it that we find prevalent today. Just to shift angle a little bit here, Christy, to get us along a little further here and to connect with the everyday real, have you ever known anybody who says, well, sure, I'm a conservative?
Of course, yes.
All right. Who are these people? You don't need to name names, but that would be okay too.
I won't name names, but I do think there definitely is an ideology behind being a conservative. It's very much rooted in this, which I believe started in the 1980s, kind of Jerry Falwell's moral majority. We're conservatives, we're for God and country and freedom. Yeah, America. And there's something good to be said for that. Certainly, I'm very, pro-God, and I don't think we should all go around bashing our country and whatever, but I do think I really like this essay, and I think it should be like the American Solidarity Party official essay or something like that. I feel like
we have a color. We have an official color. We have an official song.
Oh yeah. Well. Yeah, it could be our official essay, because I think a lot of people, myself included, kind of grew up with this: to be a good Catholic, to be a good Christian, to be a good person, you have to be a conservative. And then you look at the Beatitudes, you look at Christian or Catholic social justice teaching, And you think, wait a second, this isn't what it means to be a good Catholic, good Christian, good citizen, good person. And I'm not saying that every Catholic or Christian has to be a bleeding heart liberal, but I think we do need to look critically and not just fall back on what the people in our parishes or the people in our towns or the people in our communities are saying is the right thing to be doing, and think, well, how can we actively pursue change? And I think that's what the American Solidarity Party has been doing. I think there's a lot of former Republicans or former conservatives, or maybe people who still consider themselves, to the right of center, more conservative leaning, but are willing to look at things critically and are willing to kind of see how these problems in our society can be resolved and not necessarily just fall back on the same textbook conservative answers.
Would you say, Christy, that the way you're presenting the conservative, beginning with the Jerry Falwell link, and of course, our friend Peter Maurin had been dead for decades before Jerry surfaced. Would you say that we could just as well, or maybe even more accurately, refer to that pattern of thought as nationalist rather than conservative?
I think some conservatives definitely do fall under the label of nationalist. I think there's kind of a temptation in this whole Make America Great Again era, if you are a conservative, to kind of jump on the nationalist ship. But I don't think you necessarily have to be a nationalist to be.
Right. Slippery terms again. We have this old-fashioned term, America, love it or leave it, old-fashioned expression, and then my country, right or wrong, but my country. Yes, Mario.
Yeah, a couple of things there that come to mind. Perhaps we need to be careful about the term nationalism, which is begin in the 1700 and the nation state, and has a reason for that, because we as a human being are historical beings, and we are attached to our traditions. We are attached to our way of doing things. We don't love the law, the rule of law, and we love our family, our language. So there is a reason why nationalism came into place in order to unify what later became to be known nation states. Now, to what extent we can exaggerate that nationalism is another matter, because beginning the 18th century and 19th century, nationalism was a common thread of many political systems. That's one thing. And today, perhaps we has a very negative view, or many people have a negative view of nationalism, because we lack the capacity sometimes to make those distinctions which evolve over time. That's one thing. Another thing I'm curious to hear from you is that about conservatism, if you will, because here what Peter is saying, and he's writing here in the 1930s probably, he's talking about conservative, try to believe things are good enough, etc., etc. And I see there's kind of rejecting this kind of construction about reality. That's perhaps his view. But there is another slightly different view of conservatives, or at least that's my impression, and that is why I want to ask you. And that is the description or the definition, if you will, that Russell Kirk make of conservatism. Since you are from Michigan, I think, or you studied in Michigan.
Michigan. Yes.
You know a little bit about Russell Kirk, how he portrayed conservatism?
A couple of things on Kirk, Russell Kirk, a.k.a. the Sage of Makasta. Quick sidebar. My dad always used to say, you know, Russell Kirk, he really believes that there are ghosts. And although Russell Kirk is known as a historian of conservative isms, identified in various sorts, he also wrote some powerful ghost stories. All right, enough of those sidebars. I think Russell Kirk wanted to emphasize, and there's a connection here with this journal, First Things, conservatism as a concern for what is enduring, what is fundamental, and a kind of wariness of quick fixes, a wariness of radical upheavals that really had no direction, raising hell for the sake of raising hell. And Russell Kirk looked to, historically, and we've been citing a historian of the Civil War, looked to the sources of conservatism in America. And Russell Kirk was very much aware of personalism, and personalists have been active in the American Solidarity Party. In fact, he insisted that the word individual be replaced by the word person in the writing of people connected with fundamental documents of American conservatism. So I think Russell Kirk and people on ASP, Solidarity Party websites, have frequently mentioned him. He's a very balanced sort of conservative, and I think what he would say is that Trump has nothing to do with conservatism at all. And I feel sorry for people that get stuck with labels that get hijacked by other people that really have no connection. Couple of other points. And first, I want to say something about nationalism, and then I want to say something that I think Matthew Bartko would say if he were here, and I wish he were. We could imagine people who are traditionalists, but not nationalists. And we need only think of the Amish. The Amish have no commitment to any nation state, but they are certainly a traditional people. And they're oftentimes dismissively referred to as ultra-Orthodox. The Jewish Orthodox people in Israel need not, and sometimes quite clearly are not, supporters of Israel as a nation state. They think that, in fact, Israel is probably the best place for a Jew to be, but the very fact that Israel has nationalist pretensions is just an echo of the people of God, the chosen people, choosing kings in the Old Testament. Well, maybe it's got to be that way, but we sure could do better. So I want to make that distinction between traditionalism and nationalism. At the same time, the idea of a nation state is, as you rightly point out, something relatively new. It's oftentimes associated with the Treaty of Westphalia. Think 1690s, at the end of these wars in Europe, which were sometimes wars of religion or wars of the abuse of religion. The Treaty of Westphalia says, well, it all depends on what country you live in. Whoever is the prince of the country, using prince generically, whatever his religion is, that should be the religion of everybody in the country, and that way, you see, we won't have these endless religious wars. Well, the Peace of Westphalia was widely embraced by European powers, but rejected by the Holy See on the grounds that that's not what religion is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be something that props up the state. It's something that's to be independent of the state. Now, this is the last little rantito I'll offer. If our friend Matthew Matthew, I hope you're well enough to listen. If Matthew Bartko were here, he'd say, "What's this? The world is getting worse every day in every way, and the world is getting worse every day in every way because the world is upside down." Well, as an evangelical, Matthew, I think, would say in a fundamental sort of way, the world is upside down, but it's not getting worse every day in every way. And one of the points that he would make is the number of people in absolute poverty is less than it has been in recent decades. The number of people who have access to real medical care, as opposed to, say, Vicks VapoRub, the number of people that have access to real medical care is more than it has been in the past. And with the kinds of communication we have today, take the web into account, for example, more news is available to more people than it ever has been before, and there's a challenge of sorting out real news from fake news, but nonetheless, the world is closer, each person to each person, because of true advances in communication. So I think Matthew would say, hold on, the world is getting worse every day in every way. Not so. Not so. There are real gains. Try penicillin. You'll like it. It'll save your life. And that would be a kind of dated example. There are a whole lot of medical interventions that people as old as Mario and me and, of course, Sebastian will be taking advantage of. So that would be a corrective to Peter from Matthew, I'll bet. All right, Christy, say something to us.
Uh-oh.
You knew you'd be next. You knew you'd be next.
I know. I think you're right. I think that, I don't know if I was to if I was God and I were to do kind of a tally of the good and bad in the world, what the tally would be, and if the world is getting better or worse. I think in many ways the world is getting better, and in many ways it's getting worse. And I think sometimes those are in the same ways. With the example of feminism, I think is the perfect example of how in some ways we're getting a lot better with the Me Too movement, with kind of this recognition of that a woman can be a mother and also can be a worker if she chooses, or if she chooses not to be, that's fine. But I think there's also a downside to that, with the whole shout your abortion kind of thing, with this whole polarization of feminism. So, yeah, I don't know. That was just the example that popped into my head. It is getting better.
It is perplexing. Now, as I read him, and I so often do read him, Jacques Maritain had a view that it's not so much that the world is getting better, there we go, or the world is getting worse, there it goes, but rather that the stakes are getting higher and higher and higher. And when I think of, say, nuclear assured mutual destruction, and when I think of a count yesterday I saw that in the past year worldwide, there have been something like 46 million abortions, I think, yeah, the stakes are getting higher and higher. And it's not as if the eschaton, the second coming, is described as, and finally everything got sorted out, everything was peachy keen, and Jesus came to take us home. That's not the scriptural imagery that we find at all.
But Jim,
Yes.
A couple of things here. We need to, I think, yes, I agree that his view about what we may call real things today, or in Peter's time, was quite pessimistic, if you will. He didn't see some things go better, some things may not go better. But overall, behind his, again, worldview, if you will, because behind his take of reality, if you will, his realism or his personalism, there is an overall theme, which is what does the world mean? What good means? Now, if that is the case, then we need to explore more and about his perspective, if you will. And at the end, I think one of his the next essay, when he talked about radical change. What is radical change? It's not radical change of an ideology or radical change within an ideology. It's a different radical change. So what is good, what is the aim of society must be measured against this goal. And finally, this point. Sometimes we discuss about things getting better or getting worse based upon an idea that we have about progress set up by the agenda of contemporary ideologies. By that, I mean that, say, yes, we have vaccine, we have technology, we have everything. So everything seems to be fine. And then we have enlightenment reaching to its peak today, and everything seems to be fine. And then look at another ideology, say, no, everything is going to be destroyed because this is capitalism and this is free market and everything in between. So that we have a competing views about what progress really means. But generally, this discussion is within the framework of an ideology. But I think Peter Maurin and personalism has a different view of that. It's a different human experience. And I think we need to explore that. What does really progress means? In the 19th century, it's very telling this. In particular in Latin America, the influence of positivism, French positivism, was so rampant that many of the national symbols in Latin America were expressing words such as progress. And progress was written with capital P. But that was an ideology at that time. And I think continue being the case. So my proposal is to, in another program, to discuss about what does really progress mean.
Aha. Excellent proposal. I wonder, Mario, if you could read the last of our three essays, and then I'll close with the gospel from today's liturgy.
Okay. A radical change. The order of the day is to talk about the social order. Conservative would like to keep it from changing, but they don't know how. Liberals try to patch it and call it a New Deal. Socialists want a change, but a gradual change. Communists want a change, an immediate change, but a socialist change. Communists in Russia do not build communism, they build socialism. Communists want to pass from capitalism to socialism and from socialism to communism. I want a change and a radical change. I want a change from acquisitive society to a functional society, from a society of go-getters to a society of go-givers.
Yes, to be continued. Let's end with the gospel from today's liturgy, from the gospel according to John. John was standing with two of his disciples, and as he watched Jesus walk by, he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard what he said and followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following him and said to them, "What are you looking for?" They said to him, "Rabbi," which translated means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come, and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day. It was about 4 in the afternoon. Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, was one of the two who heard John and followed Jesus. He first found his own brother Simon and told him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated Christ. Then he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You will be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. The Gospel of the Lord. We'll return next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.